At my granddaughter's wedding, I saw my name printed in elegant gold letters. The old lady footing the bill. I smiled when I read it, the same way I had smiled the moment I first realized my family had already decided who I was to them. I'm Margaret Collins, 72 years old. And I've spent most of my life believing that love was something you proved through quiet sacrifices. That morning, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, fastening a pair of pearl earrings my late husband, Thomas, had given me on our 40th anniversary. The soft blue dress I chose was one he always said made me look like the calm before a storm, though I never quite understood what he meant until much later. Emily's wedding was supposed to be one of those rare days when everything felt right again, when grief softened just enough to let joy in. It had been 3 years since Thomas passed, and while the house had grown quieter, I had convinced myself that family gatherings would still carry his warmth somehow. When I arrived at the Grand Willow Ballroom just outside Hartford, the place was already glowing with polished chandeliers and carefully arranged white roses, every detail whispering elegance and perfection. A young woman at the check-in table greeted me with a bright smile and handed me my name card without hesitation. I thanked her, assuming it would read Margaret Collins, grandmother of the bride. Instead, those words stared back at me, deliberate and unmistakable. For a brief moment, my fingers tightened around the card, but then I let my shoulders relax and pinned it neatly to my chest. No scene. No questions. Just a quiet acceptance that felt almost rehearsed. As I stepped into the ballroom, I noticed how conversations dipped ever so slightly when I passed, how a few guests glanced at my name tag and then quickly looked away. Others didn't bother hiding their amusement. I moved through the room with measured steps, my posture straight, my smile steady, as though I hadn't spent the past decade ensuring every opportunity, every comfort, every advantage my son Richard and his family enjoyed had been built on the foundation Thomas and I created together. Pamela stood near the center of the room, radiant in a tailored ivory gown that wasn't meant for her but somehow commanded attention just the same. She greeted guests with effortless charm, her laughter light and practiced, her hand resting gently on Richard's arm as though she had always belonged at the center of everything. When she saw me, her smile widened just enough to be noticed, but her eyes remained unchanged, cool and calculating. "Margaret, you made it," she said, her tone sweet in a way that never quite reached sincerity. "Everything looks beautiful," I replied, and I meant it. It was beautiful. That was the problem. Every perfect detail had been paid for, arranged, and finalized without a single real conversation with me, despite the fact that every invoice had quietly made its way to my address. I found my seat at a table near the back of the room, far enough from the main stage to feel like an afterthought but close enough to observe everything clearly. As I sat down, I overheard a couple at the neighboring table whispering, their voices low but not low enough. "That's her," one of them said. "The one who paid for all of this." The other chuckled softly. "Must be nice to have a walking bank account in the family." I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip as if the words hadn't landed exactly where they were meant to. Across the room, Emily stood with her bridesmaids, glowing in a way only someone untouched by truth can glow. I loved her. I truly did. And perhaps that was why I had allowed things to go this far, why I had convinced myself that generosity would eventually be met with gratitude, that silence would preserve peace. But peace, I was beginning to understand, had been carefully redefined without me. A server passed by offering champagne, and I accepted a glass, watching the bubbles rise to the surface as conversations swelled around me. There was laughter, music, the soft clinking of glasses, all the sounds of a celebration that looked perfect from the outside. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else, something I had learned to recognize over the past year. A pattern. Small exclusions. Quiet decisions made without me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I had noticed them one by one, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense until you stepped back far enough to see the full picture. I had asked myself more than once if I was imagining it, if grief had made me overly sensitive, if I was holding on too tightly to a version of family that no longer existed. But that name tag, simple as it was, had answered every question I hadn't been brave enough to ask out loud. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a joke that went too far. It was a statement. And as I sat there, surrounded by people who saw me not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as a resource, I realized something else just as clearly. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. I remained seated long after the initial wave of greetings had passed, watching the room settle into its rhythm as servers moved gracefully between tables and the string quartet near the stage shifted into a softer melody. The longer I sat there, the more I began to notice the details I might have once ignored, the subtle choreography of a family that had learned how to function without ever truly including me. Richard stood near the bar now, laughing with a group of men I vaguely recognized from his business circles, his hand resting casually in his pocket, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen around me in years. When our eyes briefly met across the room, he gave me a polite nod, the kind you might offer a distant acquaintance, and then turned back to his conversation as though nothing of importance had passed between us. I remembered a time when that same boy used to run across a crowded room just to sit beside me, when his voice would soften whenever he said the word mom, as if it meant something sacred. That version of him felt like a story I had once read rather than a life I had actually lived. Pamela, meanwhile, moved effortlessly from one group to another, her presence both warm and carefully measured, as though she understood exactly how much charm to offer and when to withdraw it. I watched her pause beside a cluster of guests near the center table, lowering her voice just enough to create intimacy, and though I could not hear every word, I caught enough to understand the intention behind them. She gestured lightly in my direction, a small flick of her wrist, followed by a smile that invited quiet laughter. It was not loud or cruel, not the kind of mockery that would draw attention, but something far more refined, something that allowed everyone involved to feel as though they were simply participating in harmless conversation. That was how it had always been with her. Nothing direct, nothing that could be easily confronted, just enough to shape perception, to guide people toward a conclusion without ever stating it outright. I placed my glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as though precision could steady the thoughts forming in my mind. This was not new. That was the part that unsettled me the most. There had been other moments scattered across the past few years that now began to rise to the surface with uncomfortable clarity. The birthday dinner I had been told was rescheduled, only to see photos the next day of everyone gathered without me. The holiday invitation that arrived late, after plans had already been finalized. The quiet decisions about family finances that I was informed of only after they had been made, always accompanied by a reassuring explanation that everything had been handled for my convenience. At the time I had accepted those explanations, telling myself that families change, that roles shift, that perhaps it was natural for me to step back as the younger generation took control. I had mistaken exclusion for evolution, silence for peace. But sitting there in that ballroom, with my name reduced to a line of elegant lettering that defined my worth in a single sentence, I could no longer pretend that these were isolated misunderstandings. They were choices. Consistent, deliberate choices. A server approached to refill my glass, and I thanked him with a small nod, noticing how easily kindness still came to me, how instinctively I reached for grace even when it was not returned. Across the room, Emily had begun greeting guests at each table, her laughter bright and genuine as she accepted compliments and well wishes. When she reached mine, she leaned down to embrace me, her perfume light and familiar, and for a moment I allowed myself to simply hold her, to remember the little girl who used to sit beside me in the kitchen while I baked cookies on Sunday afternoons. "Grandma, I am so glad you are here," she said, pulling back with a smile that felt sincere, at least in that moment. I studied her face, searching for any trace of awareness, any sign that she understood what had been done, but there was none. Whatever had been planned, whatever decisions had been made, she had either accepted them without question or had been kept just far enough from the truth to remain untouched by it. "I would not have missed it," I replied, my voice steady, my words chosen carefully. And I meant that too. Not because of the celebration itself, but because something in me needed to see this clearly, to witness the full extent of what had been unfolding around me. As Emily moved on to the next table, I leaned back in my chair and let my gaze drift toward the far end of the room, where a familiar figure stood just beyond the main crowd. Daniel Reeves. Even from a distance, there was something unmistakable about him, the quiet composure, the way he observed rather than participated. He had been Thomas's attorney for over 30 years, a man who spoke only when necessary and never without purpose. Our eyes met briefly, and in that single exchange I felt a question pass between us, unspoken but unmistakable. "Are you ready?" I held his gaze for a moment longer than was polite, then gave the slightest inclination of my head. Not yet. Not quite. There was still more I needed to understand. More I needed to see with my own eyes before anything could be said aloud. And so I remained where I was, seated quietly at the edge of a celebration that no longer belonged to me, waiting with a patience that had been mistaken for weakness for far too long. I remained seated long after the initial wave of greetings had passed, watching the room settle into its rhythm as servers moved gracefully between tables and the string quartet near the stage shifted into a softer melody. The longer I sat there, the more I began to notice the details I might have once ignored, the subtle choreography of a family that had learned how to function without ever truly including me. Richard stood near the bar now, laughing with a group of men I vaguely recognized from his business circles, his hand resting casually in his pocket, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen around me in years. When our eyes briefly met across the room, he gave me a polite nod, the kind you might offer a distant acquaintance, and then turned back to his conversation as though nothing of importance had passed between us. I remembered a time when that same boy used to run across a crowded room just to sit beside me, when his voice would soften whenever he said the word mom, as if it meant something sacred. That version of him felt like a story I had once read rather than a life I had actually lived. Pamela, meanwhile, moved effortlessly from one group to another, her presence both warm and carefully measured, as though she understood exactly how much charm to offer and when to withdraw it. I watched her pause beside a cluster of guests near the center table, lowering her voice just enough to create intimacy, and though I could not hear every word, I caught enough to understand the intention behind them. She gestured lightly in my direction, a small flick of her wrist, followed by a smile that invited quiet laughter. It was not loud or cruel, not the kind of mockery that would draw attention, but something far more refined, something that allowed everyone involved to feel as though they were simply participating in harmless conversation. That was how it had always been with her. Nothing direct, nothing that could be easily confronted, just enough to shape perception, to guide people toward a conclusion without ever stating it outright. I placed my glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as though precision could steady the thoughts forming in my mind. This was not new. That was the part that unsettled me the most. There had been other moments scattered across the past few years that now began to rise to the surface with uncomfortable clarity. The birthday dinner I had been told was rescheduled, only to see photos the next day of everyone gathered without me. The holiday invitation that arrived late, after plans had already been finalized. The quiet decisions about family finances that I was informed of only after they had been made, always accompanied by a reassuring explanation that everything had been handled for my convenience. At the time I had accepted those explanations, telling myself that families change, that roles shift, that perhaps it was natural for me to step back as the younger generation took control. I had mistaken exclusion for evolution, silence for peace. But sitting there in that ballroom, with my name reduced to a line of elegant lettering that defined my worth in a single sentence, I could no longer pretend that these were isolated misunderstandings. They were choices. Consistent, deliberate choices. A server approached to refill my glass, and I thanked him with a small nod, noticing how easily kindness still came to me, how instinctively I reached for grace even when it was not returned. Across the room, Emily had begun greeting guests at each table, her laughter bright and genuine as she accepted compliments and well wishes. When she reached mine, she leaned down to embrace me, her perfume light and familiar, and for a moment I allowed myself to simply hold her, to remember the little girl who used to sit beside me in the kitchen while I baked cookies on Sunday afternoons. "Grandma, I am so glad you are here," she said, pulling back with a smile that felt sincere, at least in that moment. I studied her face, searching for any trace of awareness, any sign that she understood what had been done, but there was none. Whatever had been planned, whatever decisions had been made, she had either accepted them without question or had been kept just far enough from the truth to remain untouched by it. "I would not have missed it," I replied, my voice steady, my words chosen carefully. And I meant that too. Not because of the celebration itself, but because something in me needed to see this clearly, to witness the full extent of what had been unfolding around me. As Emily moved on to the next table, I leaned back in my chair and let my gaze drift toward the far end of the room, where a familiar figure stood just beyond the main crowd. Daniel Reeves. Even from a distance, there was something unmistakable about him. The quiet composure, the way he observed rather than participated. He had been Thomas's attorney for over 30 years, a man who spoke only when necessary and never without purpose. Our eyes met briefly, and in that single exchange I felt a question pass between us, unspoken but unmistakable. "Are you ready?" I held his gaze for a moment longer than was polite, then gave the slightest inclination of my head. Not yet. Not quite. There was still more I needed to understand, more I needed to see with my own eyes before anything could be said aloud. And so I remained where I was, seated quietly at the edge of a celebration that no longer belonged to me, waiting with a patience that had been mistaken for weakness for far too long. The music softened as the evening began to shift from polite conversation into something more structured, more intentional, the kind of moment where families present themselves in their best light, while quietly reinforcing everything that lies beneath the surface. I watched as the wedding planner moved toward the stage, signaling the transition into speeches, and a subtle tension settled over the room like a thin layer of glass. People adjusted in their seats, turning their attention forward, their expressions expectant, unaware of how much truth could be revealed in moments like these. Pamela made her way to the microphone first, her posture flawless, her smile warm enough to draw the entire room in. She thanked the guests, spoke about love, about family, about the importance of support and unity, her voice steady and practiced in a way that suggested she had rehearsed every word. From where I sat, I could see how easily people believed her, how quickly they accepted the version of our family she was presenting, polished and complete. There was no trace of exclusion in her tone, no hint of the quiet calculations that had shaped this evening. Just a narrative that placed everyone exactly where they were meant to be, including me, though not in the way most would recognize. At one point she paused, her gaze sweeping across the room until it landed briefly on me, and in that moment, her smile shifted just enough to reveal something beneath it, something sharper. "And of course," she continued, "none of this would have been possible without the generosity that runs so deeply in this family." A few guests turned subtly in my direction, their smiles polite, their eyes curious, as if acknowledging a role that had already been defined for me. I inclined my head slightly, offering the same composed acknowledgement I had maintained all evening, even as the weight of her words settled into something more deliberate than gratitude. It was not appreciation she was offering. It was positioning, a careful reminder of where I stood in the story she was telling. As the applause faded, Richard took the microphone next, his tone lighter, more casual, but no less revealing. He spoke about Emily's childhood, about the pride he felt watching her grow into the woman she had become, and for a moment, I allowed myself to listen without analysis, to simply hear the voice of my son as it once was. But then, almost as if guided by the same invisible script, he added, "And we are especially grateful to Mom for always being there when it matters most." There was laughter in his voice, a softness that might have sounded affectionate to anyone else, but I heard the undertone, the subtle reduction of a lifetime into a single convenient function. Being there when it matters most. Not raising him. Not building a home. Not standing beside Thomas through every risk and sacrifice that created the life he now enjoyed. Just being there as needed. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the familiar steadiness return, the quiet clarity that had been forming since the moment I read that name tag. This was not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern reaching its natural conclusion. Around me, guests nodded, some smiling, others lifting their glasses slightly in my direction, acknowledging the role I had been assigned without ever questioning who had written it. The speeches continued, each one layering more warmth onto the surface of the evening, more stories, more laughter, more carefully chosen words that reinforced the illusion of a united family. And yet, beneath it all, I could feel the same current running through everything, subtle but undeniable, a quiet agreement about who held value and who simply provided it. I glanced once more toward Daniel Reeves, who remained near the back of the room, his presence as unobtrusive as ever, yet impossible to ignore if you knew where to look. He had not moved since I last noticed him, his attention fixed not on the stage, but on me, as though he understood that the most important moment of the evening had not yet arrived. I let my gaze linger for just a second before returning it to the front, allowing the final speech to conclude and the room to fill once again with applause. Glasses were raised. Music began to swell again. Conversations resumed louder. Now freer, as if the formalities had given everyone permission to relax. But for me, something had shifted entirely. The performance was over, at least the part where I was expected to remain quietly in the background, defined by the narrative others had created. I reached up and adjusted the edge of my name tag, smoothing it against my dress with the same careful precision I had shown all evening. Then I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and placed my hands gently on the arms of my chair. I had spent years believing that silence preserved dignity, that patience would eventually be met with respect. But sitting there, surrounded by people who had mistaken my restraint for absence, I understood something with absolute clarity. Silence in the wrong hands becomes permission, and I had given them far too much of it. For a long time I did not move, even as the music grew louder and the room returned to its comfortable rhythm of celebration, because something inside me had already stepped outside of it. I watched as guests rose from their chairs, as glasses were refilled and conversations resumed, but none of it reached me the way it once would have. It was as if a quiet distance had settled between me and everything else, a clarity that made each interaction easier to understand and, in some ways, easier to accept. I was no longer searching for warmth where there was none. I was no longer trying to interpret kindness that had never been intended. And in that stillness, I felt something unfamiliar begin to take shape. Not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of calm that comes when the truth no longer needs to be softened. I reached for my clutch and stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress as I did, aware of the way a few nearby guests glanced in my direction, curious but cautious, as though unsure whether my movement signaled anything worth noticing. Did not, at least not yet. I moved away from the table at an unhurried pace, passing between clusters of people who were too absorbed in their own conversations to pay me much attention, and made my way toward the quieter edge of the ballroom where the tall windows overlooked the dark outline of the gardens outside. The glass reflected the room behind me, a soft blur of light and movement, and for a moment I stood there looking at both worlds at once, the one I had been part of and the one I was beginning to step into. "You have always had a remarkable sense of timing," a familiar voice said quietly from just behind my shoulder. I did not turn immediately, but I allowed myself a small breath before facing him. Daniel Reeves stood there, his expression composed, his presence as steady as it had always been. Up close, the lines on his face were more pronounced than I remembered, but his eyes were unchanged, sharp and observant, missing very little. "I was beginning to wonder if you would prefer to let the evening pass without interruption," he added, his tone neutral, offering no judgment, only an observation. "I needed to see it clearly," I replied, my voice calm, measured, carrying none of the weight it might have held earlier in the evening. "All of it." He nodded once, as though that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And now that you have?" he asked gently. I glanced back toward the center of the room, where Pamela stood surrounded by guests, her laughter rising above the others, effortless and assured, as though nothing in the world could disrupt the image she had created. Richard was beside her again, his posture relaxed, his attention fully engaged in the life he had built, a life that no longer required me except in the ways that benefited him. "Now," I said quietly, "I understand what Thomas meant." Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, his interest sharpening. "About what?" he asked. I met his eyes then, holding them with a steadiness that surprised even me. "About preparation," I said. "He always believed that people reveal themselves when they think there are no consequences." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Daniel's mouth, not out of amusement but recognition. "He was a very perceptive man," he said, "and a very thorough one." I let those words settle between us for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of them, the way they connected the past to the present in a way that felt almost intentional. Thomas had never rushed decisions. He had never acted without considering every possibility, every outcome. And in the final months of his life, when his health had begun to fail, there had been a certain focus in him, a quiet determination that I had noticed but not fully understood at the time. "You brought it with you," I said, not as a question but as a statement. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements deliberate, unhurried, and withdrew a sealed envelope, its edges crisp, its surface unmarked except for a single line written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. My name. He held it out to me, but did not release it immediately, his gaze steady on mine. "He asked me to wait," Daniel said softly. "Not for a specific date, not for a particular event, but for a moment when it would matter." I looked down at the envelope, at the familiar script that seemed to bridge the distance between then and now, and for a brief second, I felt something shift inside me, not a return to the past, but a recognition of how carefully it had been considered. "And you believe this is that moment?" I said. Daniel did not hesitate. "I believe," he replied, "that you already know it is." The music swelled again behind us, laughter rising, glasses clinking, the celebration continuing as though nothing of consequence was unfolding just a few steps away. I closed my fingers around the envelope, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but significant in a way that had nothing to do with paper or ink. And as I lifted my eyes back toward the room, toward the people who had so confidently defined my place within it, I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They had spent the entire evening showing me exactly who they were. Now it was my turn to decide what that meant. I did not open the envelope right away, even though every instinct told me that whatever was inside would change everything, because for the first time in a very long time, I understood the value of timing. Instead, I held it gently in my hands, tracing the edge of the paper with my thumb as I walked back toward my table, aware of how easily something so small could carry the weight of an entire legacy. Around me, the celebration continued without interruption, the music now brighter, the conversations louder, the atmosphere lighter as guests moved further into the comfort of the evening. No one noticed the shift in me, and that, I realized, was precisely why this moment mattered. I resumed my seat with the same composed posture I had maintained all night, placing the envelope carefully beside my glass as though it were nothing more than a simple piece of correspondence. Across the room, Pamela was now speaking with a group of women near the dance floor, her gestures animated, her laughter effortless, as if she had already secured everything she believed belonged to her. Richard stood not far from her, nodding along to a conversation about business investments, his expression confident, grounded in a future he assumed was already guaranteed. I studied them both for a moment, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet detachment that made everything easier to see. This was not about a single evening or a single insult. It was about a pattern that had been allowed to grow unchecked. A series of small decisions that had slowly redefined my place in their lives until I was no longer a person, but a function, a resource, a certainty they no longer questioned. I reached for my glass and took a slow sip, letting the coolness steady me as I considered what came next. The envelope remained unopened at my side, its presence steady, patient, almost as if it understood that its purpose was not to rush me, but to wait until I was ready to act with intention rather than emotion. That, I realized, was the difference between reacting and responding, something Thomas had always understood better than anyone. He had never allowed himself to be driven by impulse. He observed. He calculated. And when he acted, it was always with clarity. I placed the glass down and rested my hands lightly on the table, allowing my gaze to drift once more across the room, taking in the details I might have missed before. The way Pamela subtly directed conversations, guiding people toward certain impressions without ever appearing controlling. The way Richard deferred to her in small, almost imperceptible ways, allowing her to shape the narrative of their lives together. The way even Emily, in her happiness, had accepted the structure around her without question, trusting that the people guiding her had her best interests at heart. It was not cruelty in the way people often imagine it, loud and obvious and impossible to ignore. It was quieter than that. More refined, a gradual reshaping of reality until no one remembered what it had once been. And for a long time, I had allowed myself to be part of that reshaping, believing that patience and generosity would preserve something that had already begun to change. A server approached to ask if I needed anything, and I shook my head gently, offering a polite smile that required no effort now. I no longer needed reassurance from the people around me. I no longer needed to interpret their actions in the best possible light. The truth had already been established, and with it came a certain freedom, one I had not expected but now recognized as necessary. I reached for the envelope again, this time turning it over in my hands, studying the seal, the careful precision with which it had been prepared. Thomas had not been a man who left things unfinished. If he had written this, if he had entrusted it to Daniel with instructions to wait, then it was not meant to be ignored. It was meant to be used. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of a belief in fairness, in accountability, in the idea that action should carry consequences, even within a family. Especially within a family. I slipped my finger beneath the edge of the seal, pausing for just a moment as I felt the faint resistance of the paper, the final barrier between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed. Around me, laughter rose again. Someone called for another round of drinks, the band shifted into a more lively tune, and the room seemed to pulse with energy, unaware of how fragile its balance truly was. Then with a steady hand I opened the envelope. The paper inside unfolded with a soft, deliberate sound, and as my eyes moved across the lines written there, I felt no shock, no confusion, only a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to understand. Thomas had seen this coming. Perhaps not the exact details, not the specific moment, but the pattern, the possibility, the risk that the people we loved might one day forget what love was supposed to look like. And he had prepared for it in the only way he knew how, not by controlling them, but by setting a boundary they could choose to respect. Or ignore. I read the final line once more, letting its meaning settle fully into place, and then I folded the paper carefully, returning it to the envelope with the same precision I had used before. When I looked up again, the room had not changed. The music was still playing. The guests were still laughing. Pamela was still smiling. But something fundamental had shifted, not around me but within me. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was something far more powerful, something quiet, steady and absolute. I was no longer waiting to understand what was happening. I understood it completely. And for the first time that evening, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The decision did not arrive with urgency or emotion, but with a quiet certainty that settled into place as naturally as breath, and once it was there, it did not waver. I remained seated for a few moments longer, allowing the rhythm of the room to continue uninterrupted, because what I was about to do was not meant to disrupt the celebration, at least not in the way people might expect. It was meant to clarify it. I reached for my glass again, taking one final, measured sip before setting it down with deliberate care, aligning it once more with the edge of the table as though everything in my world still followed the same quiet order. Then I rose. This time the movement carried a different weight, subtle but undeniable, and a few more heads turned in my direction as I stepped away from my chair. Not out of concern, not yet, but curiosity, the kind that begins as a flicker before it becomes something more. I moved toward the front of the room, my steps steady, my posture straight, the envelope held lightly in my hand at my side. The band was finishing a song, the final notes lingering in the air, and as the applause followed, I saw my opportunity in the brief pause that always comes before the next piece begins. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I simply continued forward until I reached the edge of the stage where the microphone stood unattended, waiting for the next speaker who had not yet been announced. For a fraction of a second there was a quiet question in the air, a subtle shift as people tried to understand what they were seeing. Then I stepped up, reached for the microphone and turned to face the room. Conversation softened almost immediately, not because anyone had asked them to, but because something in the moment itself required it. I looked out across the faces gathered there, some familiar, some not, all of them connected in some way to the family that had brought us together. Pamela was among the first to react, her smile freezing for just an instant before she began to move toward me, her expression carefully composed, as though she intended to guide the situation back into something predictable. Richard followed a step behind her, his brow slightly furrowed, his attention sharpening in a way I had not seen all evening. Emily stood near the center, her happiness still intact, though now touched by a hint of confusion as she watched me take a place she had not expected me to occupy. I adjusted the microphone slightly, the small sound of it echoing just enough to signal that this was no longer a casual interruption. It was a moment. "I will not take much of your time," I began, my voice calm, steady, carrying easily through the room without strain. The simplicity of the sentence seemed to settle something, giving people permission to listen without resistance. "This is a beautiful evening," I continued, allowing my gaze to move briefly toward Emily, softening just enough to acknowledge what this day was meant to be. "And I am truly glad to see so many people here to celebrate a new beginning." A few guests nodded, the familiar language of a wedding speech easing them into comfort again, into expectation. Pamela slowed her approach, reassured perhaps that this would be nothing more than a polite acknowledgement, something that would pass without consequence. I let that expectation settle fully before I continued. But sometimes, I said, pausing just long enough for the room to quiet completely, a new beginning requires us to understand what we are building it on. The shift was immediate, though subtle, a slight tightening in the air, a collective awareness that the tone had changed, even if the words themselves remained composed. I lifted the envelope slightly, not high enough to draw attention to it directly, but enough to anchor my next words in something tangible. My late husband, Thomas Collins, believed very strongly in preparation, I said, my voice unchanged, my expression calm. At the mention of his name, I saw several heads turn, recognition passing through the room in quiet waves. He believed that love should be given freely, I continued, but that respect should never be assumed. Pamela had stopped moving now, her expression no longer entirely controlled, a faint tension beginning to show beneath the surface. Richard stood beside her, his posture shifting, his attention fully fixed on me, no longer divided. I let the silence stretch just a moment longer before I spoke again. Before he passed, he made a decision, I said, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He added a clause to his will. This time there was no mistaking the reaction. It moved through the room like a quiet ripple, subtle but unmistakable, drawing every eye toward me with a focus that had not existed before. I held their attention without effort now, not because I demanded it, but because the truth, once introduced, has a way of commanding its own space. I glanced once toward Daniel, who remained at the back, his expression unchanged, offering no signal, no interruption, only presence. Then I looked back at the room, at the family who had spent so long defining me without question. It is a simple clause, I said softly, clear, fair, and very specific. I paused, not for effect but because the moment required it, because what came next would not just be heard, it would be understood. And in that understanding, everything would begin to change. The silence that followed was not immediate, but it grew, spreading slowly across the room as people leaned in, as conversations faded without being asked, as the weight of what I had just said began to settle into something real. I did not rush to fill it. I allowed it to exist because silence, when used properly, has a way of preparing people to hear what they might otherwise resist. I unfolded the paper from the envelope with steady hands, the soft sound of it carrying further than expected in a room that had become so attentive. For a brief moment my eyes moved across the lines again, not because I needed to read them, but because I wanted to honor the intention behind them, the care with which they had been written. Then I lifted my gaze back to the room. The clause states, I said, my voice calm and even, that any direct family member who knowingly humiliates, disrespects, or publicly diminishes my position within the family will immediately forfeit any inheritance designated to them under Thomas Collins's estate. There were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions, at least not at first, just a stillness that felt almost suspended, as though the room itself was taking a moment to understand what had just been placed before it. I continued before that stillness could break into noise. It also states that such forfeited portions will be redirected to charitable foundations selected in advance. This time the ripple was unmistakable. It moved through the room in subtle shifts, in exchanged glances, in the quiet tightening of expressions that could no longer maintain their previous ease. I did not need to look directly at Pamela to know that her composure had changed, but I did anyway, allowing my gaze to meet hers just long enough to acknowledge what now existed between us, not conflict, not anger, but consequence. Richard's posture had shifted as well, the relaxed confidence from earlier replaced by something more rigid, more uncertain, as though he was recalculating a reality he had assumed was fixed. Emily stood very still, her expression no longer just confused, but searching, trying to reconcile the celebration around her with the words she was hearing. I lowered the paper slightly, holding it at my side as I spoke again. Thomas did not create this clause out of suspicion, I said. He created it out of belief. He believed that the people who truly valued family would never have to think about it. A quiet murmur moved through a small section of the room, quickly contained, as though even that reaction felt too loud for the moment. He trusted that respect would be given freely, I continued, not because it was required but because it was understood. I let that thought settle, watching as it reached people differently, some with discomfort, others with quiet agreement, but all of them aware now that this was no longer just a story being told, it was something being applied. I took a small breath, not out of hesitation, but to mark the shift into what came next. Tonight, I said. I was reminded of why he felt it was necessary. There was no accusation. In my tone, no sharpness, only clarity, and somehow that made it more difficult to dismiss. I reached up then, gently touching the edge of my name tag, drawing just enough attention to it without needing to explain it outright. A few heads turned, a few expressions changed, recognition beginning to spread as people connected the detail for themselves. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. The meaning was already there, waiting to be seen. I am not here to disrupt this celebration, I said, my voice softening slightly, returning to the tone of a grandmother speaking at her granddaughter's wedding. And I am not here to create conflict. I paused, allowing that reassurance to settle because it was true. This was not about conflict. It was about truth. I am simply here to honor the conditions that were set, and to acknowledge that they have now been met. This time, the silence that followed was different. It was no longer passive. It was aware, charged with the understanding that something irreversible had just occurred, even if no one had yet spoken it aloud. I folded the paper carefully, returning it to the envelope with the same measured precision as before, as though the act itself carried a kind of finality. Then I looked out across the room one more time, my gaze steady, my expression calm, not searching for reactions, not waiting for approval, simply present in the moment as it now existed. I hope, I said quietly, that moving forward, we all remember what truly holds a family together. And with that, I stepped back from the microphone, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet composure I had carried throughout the evening, leaving behind a room that no longer felt quite the same as it had before. For a moment after I stepped away from the microphone, no one moved, as if the entire room had been suspended between what had just been said and what it meant, and in that stillness, I felt something settle inside me that had been waiting far longer than this evening alone. I returned to my table at the same unhurried pace, aware of the way conversations had not yet resumed, of the way people watched without quite knowing what they were watching for. The music, which had paused out of instinct more than instruction, slowly began again. Softer this time, uncertain, as though even the band understood that something fundamental had shifted. I reached my seat and sat down, placing the envelope beside me once more, not as a shield, not as a statement, but simply as something that had served its purpose. Across the room, Pamela stood exactly where I had left her, but the ease that had defined her earlier was gone, replaced by a stillness that did not suit her. Her smile had not returned, and though she attempted to speak to the guests around her, her words seemed to fall short of the confidence she had carried before. Richard remained beside her, his posture rigid, his attention no longer divided between conversations, but fixed inward, as though he were trying to understand where something had gone wrong without fully admitting that it had. Emily, however, was the first to move. She made her way toward me slowly, her steps careful, her expression open but uncertain, and when she reached the table, she hesitated just long enough to gather her thoughts before speaking. "Grandma," she said softly, her voice carrying a sincerity that had not been shaped by anyone else, "I did not know." I looked up at her, really looked at her, and saw not the celebration around her, not the expectations placed on her, but the person she still was beneath all of it. "I know," I replied gently, and I meant it. Whatever had been orchestrated this evening had not been hers, not in the way it had been for others. She exhaled, a quiet release of something she had been holding, and for a moment, the distance between us felt smaller, not because anything had been undone, but because something honest had been acknowledged. "I am sorry," she added, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. I reached out and placed my hand over hers, the gesture simple, familiar, the kind that had always existed between us. "This is your day," I said. "Do not let anything take that from you." She nodded, her eyes searching mine for a moment longer before she gave a small, grateful smile and stepped back, returning to the center of the room where she belonged. I watched her go, feeling a quiet sense of relief that at least one part of this family had not been entirely shaped by what had unfolded. Daniel approached my table shortly after, his presence as steady as ever, his expression unchanged but his eyes carrying a quiet acknowledgement. "It is done," he said simply. I inclined my head slightly. It is, I replied. There was no need for further explanation, no need to revisit what had already been made clear. He gave a small nod, as though confirming that everything had unfolded as it was meant to, and then stepped away, leaving me once again in a space that felt entirely my own. Around me, the room began to recover, conversations returning in cautious fragments, laughter reappearing in softer tones, as though everyone was testing whether it was appropriate to continue as before. Some avoided looking in my direction altogether, while others offered polite, uncertain smiles, unsure of how to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the one who had just stood before them. I did not seek their reactions, nor did I avoid them. I simply allowed them to exist, the same way I had allowed everything else this evening to unfold. Pamela did not approach me again. Neither did Richard. Whatever words they might have chosen, whatever explanations they might have attempted, remained unspoken, and in that silence I found a certain clarity. Not every response needs to be heard to be understood. Not every consequence needs to be argued to be real. I reached for my glass once more, finishing what remained, and then set it down with the same quiet precision as before. The evening would continue. The music would play. The celebration would carry on in whatever form it could take now. But for me, something had reached its conclusion. I was no longer the person defined by their assumptions, no longer the quiet presence they had learned to overlook. I had not raised my voice. I had not created a scene. And yet, everything that needed to be said had been said. I adjusted the edge of my name tag one final time, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, and then I let my hand fall back to my side. It no longer held the same meaning it had when I first arrived. It no longer defined anything about me at all. And as I sat there, surrounded by a family that was only just beginning to understand what they had taken for granted, I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I was not waiting for their recognition. I had already reclaimed something far more important: myself.